So, flexible endoscope care and handling, especially the small diameters. This is the control body. Where the doctor can control it, he also focuses it up here. A lot of moving parts to it. Then the insertion tube, the bending section. Then you have the light guide fiber tube and or the connector. So 5 main parts to it. This part is important to us mostly for leak testing. We're going to pretend this is your sink. Your leak tester should have a connector very similar to this. Even though it's electronic, you would hook it to the scope. You turn on the button, you have the pump, green light. If the pump's sounding wrong or doesn't look good, say something. Then you would pump the handheld one up to your backup when it reaches. Then you would take the whole scope and put it in the water entirely. So it has to have enough water surface to be underneath it completely. How long is the test? Anybody?
30 seconds.
30 seconds? Recommended 2 minutes. And the reason is they want you to angulate the scope. So it's sitting in there right now. So I'm going to pull this apart. This is the bending section. It's got a bending rubber on it. Rubber stretches. If there's a hole in it, you wouldn't see it until you angulate it. So if you stretch it, it could actually open it up. So up, down, and then what they ask you to do is to, in this case, you just massage it. If you have the scopes that have the buttons and cameras and everything on it, you want to massage those too, just because but you want to do it completely under the water. Every time you pull the scope out, it validates. The validation's gone because now you've exposed it to air you'll never know. So recommended best practice is 2 minutes. Whatever your written documentation is from the OEM and what you have on your books downstairs, follow that. We don't override it, we just tell everybody that it's recommended 2 minutes. When it's done, when do you and how do you disconnect the scope from the leak test? Anybody?
Take it out of the water. Depressurize.
Please, always take it out of the water. So what happens is if it's underneath and that pressure's there, this will open up a little bit, which could allow water in. And I've watched 6 different people in your facility, and you guys are all doing it correctly. And so it's coming out, they're making sure that it's under the water, they're making sure it's there, and then take it out. But the whole scope needs to come out of the basin. Disconnect it, put it back in, and you're good to go. Questions on that? So, leak path, bending section, most common. Small diameter scopes. Oh. Wow. This,
We don't want people taking those apart.
I don't want you taking them apart either, but I'm going to show you a leak path. So, O-ring on the top. So when it's underwater and under pressure, if you're turning the knob, you can wipe it down around it, but try not to turn it because that extra pressure will roll that O-ring. On this side of it, you have another O-ring. One of your last scopes that failed, that O-ring failed. Has a flat spot in it. So over time, when it just wear and tear, it will roll, and when it rolls to the flat spot, it now has a leak path. It's no longer got it on there. So that's one of your other main leak paths on there. So for care and handling, you guys are doing a pretty good job in your department. Where it's happening is we're seeing is upstairs in the OR, and we know that. We know that the doctors especially like to get a little robust with them. So this normally would have a boot. This is what happens when the doctor retroflexes it over time. You guys feel free to come and check this out afterwards. So that's one part. So the insertion tube, they are not all created equal. So large diameter scopes, which I know you've seen, colonoscopes, gastroscopes. Then you have the URS series. Then you have some of the P6 series. Very small. The smaller they are more fragile because they're so small, but they're all, treat them all the same, because this one can break just as easy as this one when I do that for all the components on the inside. Bending section sheath. As that bends, it will wear out. So that's the whole purpose. If you catch it, you're going to save the scope from possible, if it's electronic scope, CCD damage, 12 grand. The analog scope's not so much, but it's still the moisture to dry it out. Once water gets into the metal, it's going to cause rust, and micro will always be there. We dry them for 72 hours, so that's already 3 days down if we get it with a severe leak. We have drying systems and whatnot we put them in and can accelerate that, but if it's completely flooded, we have to dry it out to ensure that that CCD is there. So this is an O-ring. Can I get a volunteer?
Or what?
Get out of here. It's the volunteer. Here we go.
Okay.
I don't know, I'd let you say, I don't know if you're strong enough. Can you stretch that out? Do it again. Oh, you broke it. So that took him a little bit to pull that. There's no way that an O-ring this size in the scope is going to get stretched from the inside. And we know that. So what happens is it's just a normal wear and tear. This has a little bit of a burr on the end. Pass that around, that's just where it's come unseated from a larger diameter scope. That's awesome. Thanks for volunteering.
Oh, yeah.
So the O-rings, again, pressure on them is usually what just wears them out because it's a moving part. So that's not meant, but it's meant to seal and keep that water out. Small diameter fluxes, up and down. Your bigger scopes up, down, left, right. Up and or down. Again, it's a moving part. When this moves, it's got the bending rubber over it. Over time, this will break down and it will also wear the inside of the bending section out. And or it can disconnect where this is on here. Really small, really dainty. That same setup was in here. So again, the smaller the scope, more than likely the more fragile, but I could break that scope or one of your larger ones just as easy as doing this on any of them. And for the most part, your insertion tubes are looking pretty good. We haven't seen a lot of crimps or damage. Some of the larger ones, and we've taken this up with Megan and her group, they have the buckles here. And then over in Redmond, they have a lot of buckles right up in here. And if the scopes are still functional, but what's going to happen over time is going to wear that out and it's going to break that seal just from wearing. And so we recommend that those go out. So he has 4 of them that have to get cycled out for insertion tubes. But they also last him a year. So he's had no other issues other than that's just the doctor doing this. Now yesterday we pulled a scope out of here, a large diameter, had a big flat spot in it. And the flat spot, very similar to that, was up here on the umbilical. Only way that happens is just to get shut in something. So be very careful when you're loading and unloading the machines. And for the most part, like I said, I've spent several hours up there watching the process when I've done inspections and whatnot, and the handling's pretty good. But then again, it's always different when someone's watching. So just be careful that if you are loading that machine that everything's down in there, because if it pops up, you shut the lid, you will smash it. Questions, answers?
Remind me, what's the most common mistake we make here, or the most damage that you see from here?
The most damage is water intrusion. And 2 of them that we've discovered had nothing to do with the bending section, which you think, but you blow in holes in the bending rubber. They're just shoving something through the forcep where it's wearing out during the case and causing a leak. That's the number 1. The second one is the O-ring failure.
Okay.
And then for your large diameter scopes, it's the doctor that's bending it and damaging it and breaking it up here, right here on this end here. And there's a boot there, so you never see it. But it's getting wore when they retroflex it. So overall, your large diameter scopes, we know the wear and tears from the doctor and the retroflexing. Small diameter scopes, it's mostly water intrusion and the coming in from one or two places. Typically down here, number one, and then up on the O-rings, up on the seals. And that's really out of your control unless you guys are tying them in knots, which I know you're not. So that's happening in the ER environment. When Jordan gets back, we're gonna make sure that after this class is all done, then we're gonna go into the OR and do the same thing. We're gonna get with Adam's group and them and take them and have them have the exact same training. And we invite the doctors every time. So I've had a few that have come, and this is the way we were trained. This is how I was taught. I've been doing it for 30 years. Well, I can drive a car into a ditch the first day I drive it, but I don't keep doing that. So it's kind of, and they'll laugh with me a little bit, but they're set in the way they've done it and they've been trained, and it's hard to tell them because they're the guy performing the surgery. So we do the best we can just to make sure that we're doing everything else. Insertion tubes, buckled or crimps, common. Laser damage, I haven't had any of that happen here too much, but some of the other bigger facilities, a lot of their scopes, the doctor is laser happy, goes and pulls the scope back in a urology case and still has his foot on the trigger, and as he's pulling the laser out, blowing it right out the side. And that's what happened to this scope. I have another one that just blew right, just destroyed it. And
Doesn't it have harm to the patient too when they do that?
no, typically it's already out of the patient
Oh, okay.
before they pull the trigger again.
Okay.
There has been a few instances, and yeah, it will cause a fire. It will, because the gases and everything else is in there, and when they're, and if it's a spark, it'll flash them. And so, but most of the time it's when the case is done, he's got everything out, they're done, the patient's on their way out, and the doctor's talking, and there's, oh man, it's a great view. Pulls, looking out, pulling, and then he gets excited and hits that trigger. So we actually installed trigger guards on some. So the only way the doctor can do it is to put his foot in at a funky angle and hit it, and then when he's done, he's so uncomfortable he's got to take it off there. Just a faulty design, we'll call it that, or lack of design for protection. And then he'll blow it through, and when that happens, that's a full replacement of the scope. You have to replace the whole insertion tube. So that's $5,000 every time. CCD could be upwards to 12. That's the charged component, the camera, the brains of the large diameter scopes. Questions?
For the 2 minutes that we're doing the leak test, should we only be articulating it and looking at it, or can we start some of the cleaning process as well?
Yeah, what you can do is what they recommend you do is you have your endo sponge.
Yeah. So we can do
And
that
so,
at the same time.
yeah, same time. So first thing to do is the best practice is to angulate the scope up and down. Take that sponge and then wipe the scope down, and as you're doing that, no other cleaner, nothing else, because if you knock some debris off the scope, you'll see bubbles. You'll see a potential leak, and then you're like, oh, I just knocked some debris off. And so that's why you do it. You do it for the whole 2 minutes. Just literally take it and go all the way down with your endo sponge, come around here, make sure everything on top, and then go right all the way down to the connector. And by the time you do that, you're pretty much at 2 minutes. It's just a better practice to make sure that it's not leaking. Because once it goes in there, if it's got a hole in it and it's leaking, boom. So if you discover a leak, then that becomes a whole other process issue. Do you continue to process it? Some facilities won't, but then if you send it in and it's not processed, it has to be red bagged and tagged, and we have to be notified because it's a whole different process. We can't ship it. we get it there, but you're not supposed to, because it's biohazard.
Right.
And so that's why it's red bag, boxed, and locked and whatnot. And so it's a whole different process. So that's really the only thing that you guys can do is just, if you're ensuring there that that passes that leak test, and that 2 minutes, I know you're busy, and it's like 2 minutes. Goes by really quick if you're wiping everything down on the scope, especially the large diameters, because they're so big. The time you get done with it, you're good. Then you're ensuring it. Then it comes out of the water, disconnected it, and then you can put it right back in, pump in your enzymatic cleaner, hit your button, whatever the case may be. A lot of places still pour it and mix and do all their own things. I believe you guys just push a button and it feeds everything. So, any other questions? Yes?
So to clear any confusion, no, you can't clean it while it's leak testing, because you can't put your enzymatic in
That's
while it's leak
kind of what I
testing.
meant, but.
Yeah, no.
Oh,
So
got ya.
Can't save time.
Yeah. No, yeah, you can't pump the enzymatic cleaner. The only thing you can is the Endosponge, whatever's on there, that's it. And all you're doing is wiping down the extra debris. Once that's done and it's out, you put it back in there, and then you just go to town then. Thank you. So a little test on the back. We'll just walk through it. 5 basic. Five basic parts of the scope. And the reason we ask that is because, and Cindy's really good at communicating when she sends us a scope, or Megan, hey, it's the eyepiece is bad. The control bodies, it's leaking at the control body. The insertion tube has a big crimp in it. The bending section's bad. Or the light guide tube has a hole in it. So that answer is A. It has everything. There's some old schools, people have been around and they call them umbilicals. They'll call it the eyepiece section. So just whatever you call it, it helps us help identify it, and we pretty much know what it is. All small diameter flexible endoscopes have the same size insertion tube. True or false?
False.
False. And the reason we ask that is like, you can't hurt it. The smaller it is, the easier they're gonna break. Nope. I can snap all 3 of them just the same. Which statement is true?
Just use 2 hands when handling the scope.
As much as possible. If you have the scope and it's secured in your hand, you're pretty good. It's when you start letting go of stuff and Cindy comes up and wants you to grab something else, and you start letting it out, or you drop this end, or you drop the distal tip, which does have glass down in there, and it just a little bit of impact can break it, especially if you drop it from 3 feet.
Yeah.
It's always been the joke is that it doesn't pass a 3-foot drop test, because it won't. How should you store an endoscope?
See?
Is that true in all cases?
No, because we don't do that in CP. That would just be for Indeed.
Not to Mama Cindy. No, you don't, because, so the endoscopes are meant to be hung and dried, but you're putting all your stuff up for cases when it is. Follow the OEM guidelines for how you're supposed to store it, pack it, wrap it, and then it gets put up. So it's not hanging. But for general purposes, the majority of the scopes are, but a lot of facilities don't even put their small diameter scopes up. But that adds way too much time to their process to have to ensure where it's going and that
Yeah,
it's sterile.
ultimately, that would be the best practice, that you just don't have that.
Right, yeah, no, and it's, to me, the best practice is to keep it sterile until it's in that room and you open it up for the small diameters. I get why they do it, but that's, so the answer for this, if I was in endo, would be, yeah, they're hanging in the cabinets so that everything can drain out of them. Once they're dry and they're done processing in manures, they should go through a drying system of some type. I'm not sure what you guys are doing for that with your small diameter scopes, but now they have all the scope dryers out there. You hook it to it, dries it, then when you wrap it up and put it away, you're sure that you're not harboring any bacteria or moisture in there. The control knobs are part of what system? The control knobs control what?
Angulation.
The angulation. That's really what it's designed for. It makes it go up, down, left, or right. These ones are really nice because it's only up or down and it's a nice quick lever. The other ones are, if you ever seen a doctor in a case flipping them with his thumb, he likes them smooth and easy. And you can actually lock them in place, so when they're hanging also, you want to make sure that they're in the free position. The little F on the endoscopes means that it's free, that you can turn easily. He's not locking them into place. When's it okay not to use 2 hands?
Never.
C. When my supervisor isn't around, that's funny. We see that it happens, but yeah, it's not. And we really say 2 hands. Small diameter scopes especially, because they're so fragile, try to really use two hands as much as you possibly can. The only fragile part of the small diameter scope is the bending section. True or false? It's false. It's all fragile. They do wear the most because it's got the most activity, because it's always constantly bending it back and forth. And then what can cause damage? Number one is dropping the scope. No, I'm gonna say no. Doctor technician mishandling. More than likely, that's really the number one thing. We know that, but if you drop it, it's gonna break them too. Coiling the endoscope too small. There are still some facilities, and I won't pick on the VA too much longer, but they have basins half this size to put their scopes in, and they're winding them up smaller than a volleyball. The OEM case, that middle section, a little bit smaller than a volleyball, but see the bends on them? Large softball. Don't wind them any smaller than that, because when you do, you'll break them. They're designed so that, see how nice big the case is? We recommend no smaller than a volleyball, basketball size. Questions? Answers? That's
I guess,
it?
with the angulation on the tip,
Uh-huh.
can you manually, or is it always use the switch?
Always use the switch.
Okay.
So when you're cleaning it,
So don't.
yeah, when you're cleaning it, you're gonna try to keep it in the straight position. Straighten it out as best you can, and then when you clean it, it's just gonna go, you're not bending it. Because for me to have this, holding this, if it's bent, and I'm straightening it out, you see the,
Yeah.
so you're forcing that to move. It's better just to keep straight as you can, and then do your business. The only time you wanna angulate it is when you're checking for that leak.
Okay.
And long enough to look at it good. And then if you wipe it all down and you're still looking at it, I like to check them right at the beginning, and I always check them again at the end to make sure I see it, because this is the culprit most of the time, right here in that bending section.
Perfect.
Okay, that's what I got. Appreciate your time. Thanks.